The gavel came down hard on the courthouse steps, and every man in Harlan's Crossing turned to look at Matilda Wainwright like she was something that had crawled out from under a rock and dared to stand upright in the sun. She had not expected it to happen this way. She had not expected the betrayal to come from the man who claimed to be her protector, her guardian, the one soul in all of Harlan's Crossing who had sworn on her father's grave that he would see her right. But there stood Reginald Pratt, the county land commissioner, waving the deed to the Wainwright ranch like it was a flag of conquest, and every word out of his mouth was a dagger aimed directly at her chest. "This woman," Pratt was saying, his voice carrying across the crowd like the crack of a whip, "has demonstrated through her own mismanagement, her own reckless handling of finances, and her own fundamental lack of understanding of agricultural operations that she is wholly incapable of maintaining what her father built." The crowd murmured. Some men nodded. Women in bonnets pressed their lips together and looked away from her, as if witnessing her humiliation was too indecent to acknowledge, yet none of them moved to defend her. Matilda stood at the edge of the courthouse steps with her chin raised and her fists curled at her sides, and the hot July air of 1882 pressed down on her like a physical weight. She was 26 years old, and she had poured 3 years of her life, her sweat, her sleeplessness, her grief, into that ranch. 3 years since her father had died of a fever that swept through the valley like a secret punishment. 3 years of proving, every single morning, that she could do what the men in this town said a woman could not. And now Reginald Pratt, the man she had trusted with the ranch's deed while she navigated the legal mess of her father's incomplete will, stood before her with a court order and a buyer already arranged, and a smile that told her he had been planning this particular betrayal for a very long time. "The land," Pratt continued, "has been formally assessed and the estate debt has been calculated. As the authorized agent of record, I have accepted an offer on behalf of the estate from Harlan Development Partners, and the sale will proceed in 30 days unless—" "That is a lie." The voice that cut through Reginald Pratt's speech was not Matilda's, though she had been half a breath away from speaking herself. It came from the left side of the crowd, from a man who had been standing near the back with his arms crossed over his chest and his hat pulled low, a man most people in Harlan's Crossing knew by sight if not by deep acquaintance, a man who had always kept himself slightly apart from the social machinery of the town. Chester Fletcher. He walked forward through the crowd with the kind of steady, unhurried movement that made men step aside without quite knowing why they were doing it. He was broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, with the kind of lean, hard build that came not from vanity but from a decade of working land that did not cooperate. He owned the Fletcher Ranch, which bordered the Wainwright property to the north, and he had a reputation in Harlan's Crossing for being quietly fair and fiercely independent, a man who owed nothing to nobody and liked it that way. He stopped near the foot of the courthouse steps, and he looked at Reginald Pratt with steady gray eyes that held no particular anger but a great deal of certainty. "Matilda Wainwright has not mismanaged anything," Chester said, and his voice was not raised, but it carried the way voices carry in open country when there is no wind to scatter the sound. "She brought that ranch through a drought that killed half the cattle operations in this county. She renegotiated her feed contracts when prices spiked last fall. She hired on 2 new hands in the spring and expanded the south pasture. I know because I share a fence line with her. I have watched her work." He paused and looked around the crowd, making deliberate eye contact with men who had been nodding along with Pratt just moments before. "Nobody in this town has called her capable, not one of you. And I am calling her capable right now, loudly, in front of every single one of you who chose not to." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and texture to it, a silence in which people reconsider things they had decided without examining them too carefully. Matilda felt something happen inside her chest that she did not have a word for yet. It was not simply relief, and it was not simply gratitude, though it was both of those things. It was the particular shock of being seen by someone who had no obligation to see you, the vertigo of having someone speak a truth about you in public that you had spent years trying to prove in private with no audience and no acknowledgement. She had never, in 3 years of fighting for that land, heard anyone say it plainly. She was capable. She had always been capable, and Chester Fletcher had just said it loudly enough that even the men at the back of the crowd heard it. But the story of how they reached that courthouse step, the long, complicated, sometimes painful, sometimes electric road that led from strangers sharing a fence line to a man standing up in public to defend her against a hidden conspiracy. That story began not on the courthouse steps, but on a Tuesday morning in April, 14 months before, when Matilda Wainwright made the mistake of trying to fix the north fence alone. The spring of 1881 in the Texas Hill Country was what old ranchers called a deceiving spring. It looked gentle. The bluebonnets came in heavy and the creek ran clear, and the mornings were cool enough to make a person feel optimistic. But the ground was still uncertain from the winter, and the fence posts along the northern property line of the Wainwright Ranch had heaved and cracked in the freeze and thaw cycle, and Matilda had been putting off dealing with them because she had 2 sick horses in the barn, a payment coming due to the Harlan's Crossing Bank and Trust, and a foreman named Hector Dumas who had quit 3 weeks earlier to go work for the railroad, because the railroad paid more reliably than a small cattle operation run by a woman he privately doubted. She was out at the north fence at 6 in the morning with a post driver and a wagon of new cedar posts that she had cut herself from the stand of trees on the east slope, and she was making acceptable progress until the wagon horse spooked at something in the grass, lurched sideways, and dumped half the posts off the back of the wagon and into the drainage ditch that ran along the property line. Matilda stood and looked at the posts in the ditch and said several words that her father had taught her not to say in company, and then she climbed down into the ditch and started hauling posts out by hand. She was on her 4th post when she heard hoofbeats on the other side of the fence. Chester Fletcher drew up his horse and looked down at her in the ditch with an expression that was carefully neutral, which she appreciated, because the men in town generally could not manage neutrality when they found her doing physical labor. They either got condescending or they got flustered, and both reactions irritated her considerably. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said, and kept hauling. He was quiet for a moment. Then he dismounted and tied his horse to the fence and climbed over to her side without being invited, and without saying anything about it. He picked up 2 posts at once and set them on the bank. They worked in silence for several minutes. Matilda was aware of him the way you are aware of someone who moves with competence and ease, a peripheral awareness that is half observation and half something harder to name. He was maybe 30 or 31, she guessed. She knew his name and she knew his reputation, and she knew the Fletcher spread ran mostly cattle and some horses, and that was the extent of her knowledge of Chester Fletcher up to that morning. "Post drivers over here," she said, when they had all the posts out. "I see it," he said. "You got the measurements marked." "Yes, then let's get on with it." That was the whole of their conversation for the better part of 2 hours, while they reset 6 posts along the north fence line. He was useful. He knew what he was doing with a post driver, and he had good instincts for spacing, and he did not try to take over or explain things to her, which elevated him significantly in her estimation. When they finished, he gathered his tools, which were his own, because he had gone back over the fence at some point and retrieved his own tools from his saddlebag without comment, and she poured him a cup of coffee from the battered tin pot she had brought out with her. He drank it standing up, looking out over the north pasture. "You're running about 40 head out there," he observed. 43, she said. "I want to get to 60 by fall." He nodded, not the kind of nod that means I'm humoring you. The kind that means I heard you and I'm thinking about what you said. "You lost Morrison as foreman," he said. "It was not a question." "Dumas," she corrected. "And yes, 3 weeks ago. Looking for someone to replace him." I have been, but the men who come asking tend to talk to me like they expect to be managing a kitchen, not a cattle operation. She said it without particular heat, just as a statement of fact, and she watched his face for the flicker of discomfort that usually accompanied that kind of honesty. He didn't flinch, he looked at her steadily. That's their problem, he said. You need someone who can work or you need someone who can manage. There's a difference. I know the difference, she said. I know you do, he said. I'm asking what you need more right now. It was such a direct question and so genuinely practical that she answered it honestly. Someone who can work, I can manage myself. I just need hands that show up. He finished his coffee and handed back the cup. My hand Elias Torres has a cousin coming up from San Antonio next month looking for work. I can send him your way if you want. Good with cattle, doesn't have opinions about who signs his wages. I'd appreciate that, she said. He nodded, mounted his horse, and rode back north without ceremony, and Matilda stood by the fence watching the retreating figure and trying to identify the specific quality that made Chester Fletcher different from the other men in her world. And she landed on it after a moment. He had treated her like someone with a problem to solve rather than someone who was a problem. She thought about that for a long time while she drove the wagon back to the barn. Elias Torres' cousin was named Miguel Torres, and he was 22 years old and built like he had been made out of wire and determination. And he arrived the first week of May with a hat that was 3 sizes too large for him, and a work ethic that made up for every other deficiency. He knew cattle, as advertised, and he did not have opinions about Matilda's authority, and within a month she had promoted him to lead hand, and within 2 months she had hired 2 additional men on his recommendation, a father and son named Garrett and Webb Carlson, who were passing through from the Oklahoma Territory and looking for steady work. The ranch began to function with a kind of rhythm she had not achieved in the previous 2 years. Matilda rose before dawn and worked until dark and kept her accounts in a leather ledger that she updated every evening by lamplight, and the cattle operation began to show signs of real health. She increased the herd to 58 by August, brought in a new breeding bull on a payment plan negotiated directly with a rancher in Fredericksburg, and began building out the south pasture with new fencing that would let her expand the grazing rotation. She saw Chester Fletcher occasionally during this period, always at the fence line or in town. They did not have long conversations. He was not a man given to long conversations, she discovered, but the conversations they did have were always direct and substantive, and she found herself looking forward to them in a way that she filed away without examining too closely, because she was busy and she was focused, and she did not have the luxury of being distracted. In September, he came to her with a proposal, not the kind that required a ring, a business proposal. He had a bull that he was not using fully, a registered Hereford that had produced excellent calves for the Fletcher herd, and he was offering her a breeding arrangement, 2 of her cows to his bull during the fall season, in exchange for a percentage of any calves she sold at market the following spring. She reviewed the numbers he proposed in the lamplight of her kitchen table, and they were fair. More than fair, actually. The arrangement he was offering was favorable to her side of the fence in a way that she noticed. "This percentage is to your disadvantage," she said when he came back for her answer. "Does it?" he said. "You know it does." He was quiet for a moment. They were standing on her porch in the September dusk, and the air had that particular smell of dry grass and cooling stone that comes with the end of a hot summer in the Texas hill country. Crickets were starting up in the long grass, and somewhere a night bird was calling from the stand of oaks near the creek. "Let me ask you something," he said finally. "Go ahead. How long have you been fighting to keep this place alive?" She looked at him. 3 years. "And has anybody made it easier rather than harder in those 3 years?" She thought about Reginald Pratt, who had been managing the legal complications of her father's estate with a smoothness and confidence that she had at the time found reassuring. She thought about the bank officers who always seemed to schedule her loan review appointments at inconvenient times. She thought about the feed merchant who had twice quoted her higher prices than she later discovered he charged her neighbors. "No," she said. "Then let me make it a little easier," he said. "The percentage difference is not going to hurt me, but it might help you get through the next year without having to sell assets you can't afford to lose." Matilda looked at Chester Fletcher in the September dusk and felt that same wordless shift in her chest that she had felt when he handed her the fence posts, the same vertigo of being seen. She could not tell yet what it meant or what the shape of it was or whether it was wise to let herself feel it. What she knew was that it was real. "All right," she said. "Deal." They shook hands. His grip was firm and brief and entirely proper, but she was aware of the warmth of it for longer than was strictly necessary. The breeding arrangement worked well. By December, she had 2 cows confirmed with calf, and the south pasture fencing was completed ahead of schedule, and she put up a new structure on the east end of the barn that gave her better hay storage capacity through the winter. The ranch was not thriving yet, not in the way she dreamed of, but it was stable and moving in the right direction. And for the first time since her father had died, she felt something approaching security. It was in December also that she began to notice the irregularities in Reginald Pratt's management of the estate paperwork. It started small, a discrepancy in the recorded acreage of the south pasture expansion. She had purchased 3 additional acres from a neighbor named Gunderson in September, a private sale, cash settled, deed registered at the county clerk's office. When she reviewed the estate inventory that Pratt sent her quarterly, those 3 acres were not listed. She assumed it was an oversight and wrote to Pratt about it. His response came 10 days later and explained that the 3 acres were being held in a separate administrative classification, pending final resolution of the estate, a piece of legal language that sounded reasonable on the surface, but that she could not quite make logical sense of when she read it twice. She let it go for the moment and focused on the winter work. But in January, she found another discrepancy. A water rights document that her father had negotiated with the county in 1876, giving the Wainwright Ranch priority access to a tributary of the Guadalupe River that ran along the eastern edge of the property, was not included in the estate inventory at all. She knew it existed because she had seen the original document in her father's strong box, but when she checked the strong box in January, the document was not there. She had given Pratt access to the strong box during the initial estate administration, 2 years ago, when she had been grieving and overwhelmed, and had not known enough about property law to understand what she was signing over to him in terms of administrative authority. She felt a cold thing move through her when she realized the water rights document was gone. She could not say for certain that Pratt had taken it. She could not say for certain that anything suspicious was happening. But the cold thing stayed in her chest, and she began to pay attention differently, to review every document Pratt sent her with a more careful eye, to compare his records against her own notes. What she found over the following weeks was a pattern: small adjustments in recorded acreage, an unexplained administrative fee charged to the estate account, a document listing the ranch's debt load that included a figure she could not reconcile with her own careful accounting. Each discrepancy alone could be explained as an error or an oversight. Together, they formed something that looked less like carelessness and more like a trap being slowly assembled. She went to see the county clerk, a meticulous man named Theodore Baines who had been in his position for 15 years, and who was one of the few official figures in Harlan's Crossing who had always treated her with consistent professional respect. She asked to review the registered deeds associated with the Wainwright estate. What Baines showed her, after some searching through his files, made her sit very still in the wooden chair across from his desk for a long moment. There was a lien on the property. A debt instrument registered 4 months ago against the Wainwright estate, listing Reginald Pratt as the creditor for an amount that she had never borrowed, and a loan agreement that bore what appeared to be her signature. It was not her signature. "Theodore," she said carefully, "when was this registered?" "October 14, Baines said, his voice quiet and his expression carefully professional, though she could see that he understood the implications of what she was looking at. She had been in Fredericksburg on October 14th, negotiating the breeding bull payment arrangement. She had receipts and a signed contract to prove it. She had never been in this office on October 14th. She had never signed this document. "I need a copy of this," she said. "I'll make you one now," Baines said, and he did, and he handed it to her without charging her the standard copying fee. She walked out of the county clerk's office into the January cold with the copy in her coat pocket and her mind moving fast through the architecture of what Pratt had built against her. The forged lien, the missing water rights document, the inflated debt figures, the misrecorded acreage. Together they pointed toward a single outcome. If Pratt could convince a court that the estate owed a debt large enough to force a sale, and if he controlled both the creditor side of that debt and the administrative management of the estate, he could compel the sale of the Wainwright Ranch at whatever price served his interests, to whatever buyer he had already arranged. She stood in the January cold, and she was afraid, and she was furious, and she was absolutely determined. She went directly to the office of Harlan's Crossing's only lawyer, a man named Patrick Sewell, who was competent enough with contract law but whose experience with property fraud was limited, and she laid out what she had found and asked for his assessment. Sewell looked at the copied document and took off his glasses and cleaned them and put them back on, which was a habit she had observed him performing when he was uncomfortable. "This is serious," he said, "very serious, but challenging a registered document requires substantial proof of fraud, and proof of fraud requires witnesses or additional documentary evidence that can directly contradict the recorded instrument. I was out of the county on the date of registration," she said. "I have a signed contract with a rancher in Fredericksburg as proof." "That establishes your absence," Sewell said, "but a skilled attorney could argue the document was signed on a different date and registered later. You need to establish more definitively that the signature is forged." "It is forged," she said flatly. "I believe you," Sewell said, "but belief and legal proof are different things." She left his office with a clearer understanding of the mountain she was facing and a growing awareness that she was going to need help that Harlan's Crossing might not be willing to provide. It was Chester Fletcher's fence line again that brought them to the next significant moment between them. February this time, with frost on the ground and the oak trees bare and skeletal against a pale sky, and she found him repairing a section of fence on his side of the property line, and she stopped her horse and said his name. He looked up. Something in her face or her voice told him this was not a casual conversation, and he set down his tools and came to the fence. She told him everything. She told him about the lien, about the missing water rights document, about the forged signature, about the pattern of discrepancies in Pratt's estate management. She told him without editing for emotional impact or softening the details, the way she would have told another rancher about a problem with water access or cattle health, because that was what the situation required. He listened without interrupting. His face was still and attentive throughout, and when she finished there was a silence while he processed what she had said. "Pratt has buyers," he said finally. It was not a question. "That is my conclusion," she said. "Yes. Do you know who?" "Not yet. The document Baines showed me only listed Pratt as the creditor. But the land is valuable enough, especially with the water rights, that there are several interested parties in the county." Chester was quiet again for a moment. He was looking out over her property with the kind of considering expression she had come to recognize as his version of serious thinking. Then he said, "I have a contact in San Antonio, a property attorney named Hargrove. He's dealt with fraud cases before, specifically land fraud, which is not uncommon in this part of the state right now with development interests moving in from the east." "I cannot afford an attorney in San Antonio," she said immediately. "You can if I front the retainer," he said. She opened her mouth to refuse and he held up one hand. "Don't make it complicated," he said. "You can pay me back from the spring cattle sale." If the spring sale goes how I think it will, you'll have the margin for it. And if Pratt succeeds in what he's doing, there won't be a spring sale. The logic was cold and clear and entirely correct, and she knew it. She sat on her horse in the February frost and looked at Chester Fletcher and tried to see in his face what motivated this continued willingness to extend himself on her behalf. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you keep helping me?" He met her eyes. His gray eyes were direct and unhurried, the way everything about him was direct and unhurried. "Because you're a good rancher and you're working good land and what's being done to you isn't right," he said. "And because I don't like Reginald Pratt." It was not a romantic declaration. It was entirely practical and straightforward and somewhat combative in its simplicity, and she found it more moving than any number of soft words would have been, because it was honest. "All right," she said. "Send for your attorney." The attorney, whose name was Jacob Hargrove, arrived in Harlan's Crossing in the first week of March 1882, and he was a precise, dry-spoken man of about 50, with a leather satchel full of legal references and an absolute disdain for sloppiness in documentation. He spent 4 days reviewing everything Matilda had gathered, meeting with Theodore Baines at the county clerk's office, interviewing the rancher in Fredericksburg, who had signed the contract with Matilda on October 14th, and tracing the registered deed history of the Wainwright property going back 15 years. What Hargrove assembled was damning. The forged lien was the centerpiece, but it was not the whole picture. Pratt had used his position as estate administrator to file a series of small adjustments to the property records that, taken individually, looked like routine administrative corrections. But that, taken together, had the effect of reducing the recorded value of the Wainwright estate on paper while inflating its recorded debt load. The goal, Hargrove explained with the calm clarity of someone who had seen this pattern before, was to create a legal basis for a distressed sale at below market value, where the buyer, who Hargrove had traced through a business registration document to a land development company with interests in railroad expansion, would acquire the property at a price that significantly benefited both the buyer and Pratt as the arranging agent. "He's been building this for at least 18 months, Hargrove told them, seated across from Matilda and Chester in the parlor of the Harlan's Crossing Hotel where he was staying. The forged lien is the most obviously criminal element, but the administrative fraud in the estate records is also actionable. The problem is that Pratt has connections in this county. The judge who would hear a fraud claim is a man named Forrester, and Forrester and Pratt have a social relationship that makes his impartiality questionable." "Can we file in a different jurisdiction?" Chester asked. "We can, but it complicates the process and gives Pratt more time to accelerate his timeline," Hargrove said. "He knows or suspects that Miss Wainwright has been doing her own investigation. The county clerk is not someone he controls. I would expect him to move in the next 4 to 6 weeks." "Move how?" Matilda said. "Force the matter publicly before you can establish a legal challenge. Present the lien as the basis for a debt hearing, seek a court order for a supervised sale, and frame your opposition as the confused resistance of someone who doesn't understand her own financial situation." Hargrove paused and looked at her carefully. "He will attempt to discredit you before you can discredit him. The most powerful weapon he has is the general assumption of this community that you are not competent to manage the estate you inherited." That sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Matilda felt the rings of it spreading outward. "He has already been cultivating that assumption," she said quietly. "Yes," Hargrove said, "and it is the foundation of his entire scheme. A man in your position," he glanced at Chester briefly, "would never face this kind of challenge to his competence. The social context is part of the trap." Chester's jaw tightened. It was the first visible sign of emotion she had observed on his face in the months she had known him. "What do we do?" he said. "We prepare our evidence," Hargrove said. "And we be ready for him to move. When he does, we need to respond immediately and publicly with everything we have, before he can control the narrative. The preparation took 6 weeks. 6 weeks in which Matilda continued to run the ranch and pay her bills and maintain the appearance of an operation proceeding normally, while in the evenings she sat at her kitchen table with the lamplight burning and reviewed documents with Hargrove when he came out from San Antonio on weekends. And Chester came over the fence line more frequently now, under the reasonable pretext of their ongoing breeding arrangement, and stayed for the document reviews, and occasionally for supper. It was over supper in late April that things between them shifted in a way that could no longer be filed away without examination. She had made venison stew because it was what she had, and they were eating at her kitchen table with Hargrove's documents spread at one end and their bowls at the other, and she had asked Chester a question about a technical aspect of the water rights claim, and he had answered it. And then there had been a silence that was not the comfortable working silence they had established, but a different kind of silence, the kind in which something unspoken is very present. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said finally. He looked at her. "Doing what?" "All of it. The attorney, the document reviews, the fence repairs, before that the breeding arrangement. You don't owe me any of it." Chester put down his spoon and looked at her with that steady, direct gaze. "I know I don't," he said. "Then why?" She had asked him this before at the fence in February, and he had given her the practical answer. She was asking again now in her own kitchen by lamplight, and something in her voice or her face asked the question differently this time, asked the part of the question that was not about practical motivation. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he was going to give her the practical answer again or deflect entirely. Then he said, "Because you matter." 2 words, quiet and plain and with no decoration around them at all. The kind of sentence that could mean friendship or neighborly concern or something considerably larger, and the deliberate plainness of it left the larger possibility open without stating it, which she thought was both cowardly and very brave at the same time. She looked at her stew for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I haven't had much practice at mattering to people," she said, which was as honest as she could be without saying something she was not yet ready to say. "I know," he said. "Your father was a good man. But he was not good at letting people know their value." That surprised her. "You knew my father." "Some. We talked at market and at the stockyards a few times over the years." "He talked about you." Chester paused. "He was proud of you. He just didn't say it to you, and that was a failing in him." Matilda felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. Not grief exactly, because she had moved through the acute part of her grief in the first year after his death. Something more like the release of a held breath. "He never said it," she agreed quietly. "You didn't need him to say it to be what you are," Chester said, "but it would have mattered to you. It should have mattered to him to say it." The tenderness of that observation, delivered in his characteristic plain-spoken way, was almost too much to receive. She looked at the table rather than at him, because looking at him felt too direct in that moment, too exposed. "Chester," she said. "Matilda," he said, and that was all right then. But the shape of what was between them was no longer something that could be filed away without examining. Pratt moved in the second week of May, exactly as Hargrove had predicted. The summons arrived on a Tuesday, commanding Matilda to appear before a debt hearing at the Harlan's Crossing courthouse the following Friday, on the basis of the fraudulent lien, to show cause why the Wainwright estate should not be subject to a supervised sale to satisfy the claimed debt. The summons was signed by Judge Forrester. She rode over the fence line to Chester's place as soon as she had read it, and they sent a wire to Hargrove in San Antonio that afternoon. Hargrove arrived on Thursday evening. He and Matilda and Chester sat up late in the hotel, going through every piece of documentation they had assembled, organizing the evidence into the most effective sequence, preparing the affidavit from the Fredericksburg rancher that Hargrove had obtained in advance of exactly this moment. "Pratt will have the hearing controlled," Hargrove said. "Forrester will likely allow him significant latitude in presenting the debt claim before we can respond. We need to be ready to counter hard and fast when we get the floor." "Will Forrester rule fairly?" Chester asked. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "He will if we make the fraud so explicit that ruling otherwise would expose him to professional consequences he cannot afford. He is not a courageous man, but he is a careful one. If we lay out the evidence clearly enough, self-preservation will do what integrity might not." On Friday morning, Matilda Wainwright put on her best dress, which was dark blue wool and practical rather than fashionable, and she walked to the courthouse with her head up and her hands steady, even though her heart was doing something violent and irregular in her chest. The crowd that gathered on the courthouse steps was larger than she had expected. In a town like Harlan's Crossing, a land hearing with a woman defending her father's estate against a prominent citizen was a public event, and people came for it the way they came for other public spectacles. She saw faces she recognized, neighbors, merchants, women from the church her father had attended, men who had bought cattle from her operation, and men who had refused to do business with her because she was a woman running a ranch alone. She saw Reginald Pratt standing on the upper steps with his attorney, a man from Austin who looked expensive and practiced. Pratt caught her eye and gave her a small smile that was nothing but contempt dressed up as pleasantry. She looked away from him. She looked for Chester and found him near the back of the crowd, where she had not noticed him initially because he had positioned himself at the edge of the gathering rather than near the center. He met her eyes and gave her a brief, steady nod. She nodded back. Hargrove was beside her. "Ready?" he said quietly. "Yes," she said. The hearing began with Pratt's attorney presenting the lien documentation and laying out the claimed debt in expansive detail, framing it as a straightforward estate administration matter, complicated by the incompetence of the estate's heir. He was smooth and confident, and his language was designed to make Matilda sound like someone who had failed to understand her own finances, which was exactly the narrative Hargrove had predicted. Forrester sat in his chair at the top of the courthouse steps with his legal authority arranged around him like furniture and let Pratt's attorney run at length. Then it was Hargrove's turn. He was methodical and devastating. He presented the affidavit from the Fredericksburg rancher, establishing Matilda's presence out of county on the date of the lien's purported signing. He presented a document analysis from a handwriting examiner in San Antonio, the same kind used in federal court cases, that identified 7 specific characteristics by which the signature on the lien differed from Matilda's genuine signature on file with the county clerk. He presented 3 years of the Wainwright estate's financial records showing a pattern of sound management. A cattle herd grown from 28 to 61 head, new infrastructure built on existing revenue, debts reduced rather than accumulated. He presented the registration documents for Harlan Development Partners, the company that Pratt had arranged as buyer, showing that its principal officer was Pratt's brother-in-law. The crowd had gone very quiet by the time Hargrove finished. Forrester was looking at the documentation with the expression of a man who has walked into something deeper than he anticipated and is rapidly recalculating how to walk out with his reputation intact. Then Pratt began to speak, because he was not a man who accepted a position being undermined without fighting back. And what he said was the claim Hargrove had predicted, that Matilda was a confused woman who had been misled by interested parties, that the financial management of the estate was beyond her understanding, that she had demonstrated through her own behavior a fundamental incapacity that made the estate's continued operation under her stewardship a risk to the legitimate interests of the county. He was still speaking when Chester Fletcher walked forward through the crowd, and that was the moment. That was the moment the whole story had been building toward. Chester, standing at the foot of the courthouse steps with his arms uncrossed and his hat in his hand and his voice carrying out across the crowd with the flat, clear certainty of a man who had considered what he was about to say and had no second thoughts about it. "That is a lie," he said. And then he said everything. He said what he had observed about the Wainwright Ranch's management over the previous 14 months. He said it specifically and in detail, the 43 head of cattle he had counted in April of the previous year and the 61 head she was running now. He named the South Pasture expansion. He named the new hay storage. He cited the renegotiated feed contracts because she had told him about them and because facts mattered in a situation like this one. And then he said the thing that cut through all of it, cut through the legal arguments and the fraudulent documents and the social fabric of a town that had spent 3 years agreeing with each other that Matilda Wainwright was probably in over her head. "Nobody in this town has called her capable," he said, looking around the crowd. "Not one of you. And I am calling her capable right now, loudly, in front of every single one of you who chose not to." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a change. Forrester cleared his throat. He looked at the documentation in front of him, and he looked at Pratt's attorney, and he looked at the crowd, and he looked at the handwriting analysis, and the affidavit, and the financial records, and the business registration document that connected Pratt to the prospective buyer. "This hearing is suspended," he said, in a voice that carefully avoided committing to either party while signaling clearly which way the wind was now blowing. "These materials require review. A new hearing date will be set. The estate proceedings are frozen pending that review." It was not a vindication. It was a tactical retreat by a careful man who saw which way the evidence was pointing and wanted the interval to get comfortable with the inevitable. But it was, practically speaking, a victory, because it stopped Pratt from completing what he had built and gave them the time to press the criminal fraud aspect of the case through a different court with a different judge. In the crowd, the murmuring was no longer the sound of people agreeing with Reginald Pratt. It was the more uncertain, searching murmur of people reconsidering what they had accepted without examination. Matilda stood on the courthouse steps with Hargrove beside her and Chester at the edge of the crowd, and she breathed. Pratt left the courthouse steps quickly with his attorney, and his face in profile as he passed was a closed, cold thing that told her the battle was not finished even if today had gone her way. She was right about that. What followed over the next 2 months was the kind of protracted legal and social conflict that would have broken a person with less determination and less support. Pratt attempted to have the fraud case dismissed on procedural grounds in Forrester's court. Hargrove filed the criminal fraud complaint in the state district court in San Antonio, where neither Pratt's social connections nor Forrester's accommodating attitude had any reach. There were 3 more hearings, 2 legal filings, and a period in June when Pratt's lawyers attempted to intimidate Hargrove himself by filing a frivolous complaint against his bar registration, which was dismissed in 48 hours, but which was clearly designed to slow things down and cost money. Through all of it, Chester was present, not in a way that overshadowed Matilda or managed the situation for her, because that was not how he operated and it was not what she needed. He was present the way a solid fence post is present, reliable and load-bearing, and entirely uninterested in taking credit for the structure it supports. He continued to help with the ranch work during the weeks when legal obligations took her away from the property. He drove her to San Antonio for the district court hearings in his wagon, a 4-hour journey each way, and they talked during those journeys in a way they had not had occasion to talk before, without the structure of a specific problem to solve, just 2 people learning the shape of each other's thinking. She learned that Chester had come to the Texas Hill Country from Missouri at the age of 22 with $140, a horse, and a decade's worth of work ahead of him. He had built the Fletcher Ranch from raw land, made every mistake available to a young rancher, and learned from all of them with the methodical stubbornness that characterized everything he did. He had been briefly engaged to a woman in Missouri who had decided that the Texas frontier was not for her, which he described without bitterness as simply an accurate assessment of incompatibility. She told him about her mother, who had died when Matilda was 7, which was why her father had raised her with such a practical, almost masculine education, not knowing how to prepare a daughter for the domestic expectations of a conventional woman's life, and defaulting to what he knew, which was ranch work and practical knowledge, and a certain determined self-reliance. "He gave me the tools," she said during one of those wagon rides, with the San Antonio road stretching out through the live oak country ahead of them and the evening light going gold in the grass. "He just didn't give me the words for what the tools were worth." Chester was quiet for a moment. "Words matter," he said. "The silence around a thing shapes how it's understood." She looked at him. "Are you talking about my father still?" He kept his eyes on the road for a moment. Then he glanced at her briefly, and the glance was not neutral in the way his expressions usually were. It had something more personal in it. "Partly," he said. "What's the other part?" she asked. He was quiet again, long enough that she thought he was going to leave it there in that partial answer. Then he said, "I think I've been doing the same thing your father did, using practical actions instead of words because the words feel more exposed." Matilda's heart was doing the irregular thing again. She kept her voice steady. "What words?" she said. He pulled the horse to a gentle stop in the middle of the road, which was empty in both directions, just the oak trees and the grass and the evening light, and he turned to look at her fully, the way he rarely did in their interactions, that direct, unhurried gaze leveled right at her. "That I think about you constantly," he said. "That the fence line repairs, and the attorney and the document reviews and the wagon rides, none of it was purely about fairness or neighboring, though it was that too. It was about you specifically, because I think you are the most capable and the most honest and the most interesting person I have encountered in 10 years of living in this county, and I have been trying to work out the right way to say that without it complicating the situation during a time when the situation needed to stay practical." The evening birds were calling in the oaks. The horse stood patient in the road and cropped at the grass at the road's edge. Matilda looked at Chester Fletcher with his hat on his knee and his gray eyes steady and serious, and she felt the full weight of what it meant to have been seen so clearly by someone, to have been valued so consistently and so quietly, and to have him now say plainly the thing that both of them had been carefully not saying for the better part of a year. "The situation is complicated regardless," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." "Chester," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think about you constantly too," she said. The smile that crossed his face at that was not the careful, contained thing she usually saw from him, but something more open, more unguarded, and it changed the whole character of his face in a way that made her breath catch. He reached across the wagon seat and took her hand. He held it simply, without drama, his thumb moving once across her knuckles in a gesture that was tender and certain at the same time. They sat there in the road for a minute or two in the evening light, and the light went deeper gold around them, and the birds kept calling in the oaks, and it felt to Matilda like the first genuinely still moment she had experienced in 3 years. Then he picked up the reins and they drove on to San Antonio. The district court hearing in San Antonio, held in late June of 1882, was the decisive one. Hargrove presented the full case before Judge Alderman, a man with a reputation for methodical fairness and no social connections to Harlan's Crossing. The handwriting analysis was presented. The affidavit was presented. The business registration documents connecting Pratt to the prospective buyer were presented. 3 additional witnesses testified about irregularities they had personally observed in Pratt's handling of other estate administrations in the county, people who had not been willing to speak in Harlan's Crossing, but who were willing to speak in a San Antonio courtroom before a judge who had no reason to protect Pratt. Judge Alderman ruled within 4 days. The lien was declared fraudulent and expunged from the county record. The estate administration authority previously granted to Pratt was revoked and transferred directly to Matilda as the estate's sole heir and designated administrator. Criminal charges for fraud and forgery were referred to the county district attorney for prosecution. A separate order was entered directing the county clerk's office to restore all original acreage and water rights documentation to the estate record, as it had stood prior to Pratt's administrative interference. The water rights document, it turned out, had been filed with the state land office in Pratt's name as part of his scheme, and the order required its return to the Wainwright estate record. Pratt, facing criminal prosecution, left Harlan's Crossing 2 weeks after the ruling and did not return. His departure had the quality of a sudden absence, the kind that leaves a space in the social fabric and makes people uncertain how to account for the fact that they had trusted a man who had been running a hidden operation against one of their neighbors for the better part of 2 years. The criminal case against him was pursued through the district attorney's office over the following months, and he was eventually convicted in a proceeding that Matilda attended, but that no longer required her direct participation, having already won back everything that had been taken. He received a sentence of 3 years in the state penitentiary. It was not as long as the harm he had done warranted, but it was real, and it was public, and it mattered. In August of 1882, a month after the district court ruling and 2 weeks after Pratt's departure from Harlan's Crossing, Chester Fletcher came to the Wainwright Ranch on a Saturday morning when there was no legal crisis to manage and no fence to repair and no practical pretext for the visit, and Matilda met him on the porch with coffee. "The legal situation is resolved," he said. "Completely," she agreed. "Hargrove filed the final papers last week. Then the situation is no longer complicated," he said. She looked at him over her coffee cup. There was a lightness in his face that was new, or perhaps not new but newly unconstrained. "It was never uncomplicated," she said. "No," he agreed, "but the complicating factors have changed." She waited. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want to come calling like a reasonable person rather than disguised as a legal assistant. I want to take you to supper at the hotel and ride with you on Sundays and tell people directly what I mean by it." Something bloomed warm and entirely certain in Matilda's chest. "That sounds reasonable," she said. "Does it?" he said with that contained smile she had learned to read. "Yes," she said. "Chester." "Yes," he said. "I want that too," she said. "I want all of it." The courtship of Chester Fletcher and Matilda Wainwright in the fall and winter of 1882 was, by the standards of Harlan's Crossing, both conventional in its forms and entirely unconventional in its substance. He came calling on Saturday evenings and took her to the hotel dining room, which was the respectable courtship practice of the time, and he attended the Sunday church service that she occasionally attended, sitting beside her with the plain comfort of someone who belonged there. These were the forms. The substance was different from most courtship of that era in Harlan's Crossing, because both of them were too straightforward for games and too intelligent for pretense, and because the foundation of their connection had been built in a year of working through a serious crisis together, which meant that they already knew each other's steadiness under pressure, their practical intelligence, their honesty, their values. What the courtship added was the softer layer, the personal history, the preferences and memories and small daily details that fill in the picture of a person beyond their capability in a crisis. He learned that she read everything she could acquire, that her father's small library had been her primary education, and that she had supplemented it with every book, pamphlet and periodical she could borrow or trade for over the years. He learned that she was a good cook but found it a low priority, that she preferred the barn to the kitchen not because she disdained domestic work, but because animals made her feel connected to something real in a way that domestic tasks did not. He learned that she had a dry, quiet humor that emerged in private more readily than in public, and that she laughed at her own mistakes with a generosity toward herself that she had earned through a lot of hard experience. She learned that Chester was a reader also, that he had a shelf of books about land management and history, and one dog-eared volume of poems by Walt Whitman that he kept behind the other books as if slightly embarrassed by it, which she found entirely endearing. She learned that he was patient with animals and people in equal measure, but that his patience had a quality of chosen intention to it, that it was not passivity but an active decision to extend grace, which made it more impressive. She learned that he was deeply, practically loyal, that once he had decided someone was worth his trust and effort, he gave both without reservation and did not withdraw them for trivial reasons. She learned that, when he looked at her, she felt entirely and accurately known, which was something she had not known she was waiting to feel until she felt it. In November, they were riding the fence line together on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky close and gray with the first winter overcast, and the land around them had gone dormant and still and beautiful in the way of the hill country in late fall, the grasses tawny and the oak leaves bronze and the creek just audible below them. Chester pulled up his horse and said her name. She pulled up beside him and looked at him. He said, "I would like to marry you. Not will you marry me," which was the conventional phrasing. "I would like to marry you," because that was how Chester Fletcher said things, with the preference stated first and the decision implicit rather than demanded. Matilda looked at him in the gray November light, and the feeling in her chest was so large and so certain that she did not need to think about it at all. "I would like that too," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring that had belonged to his mother. He told her, a simple gold band with a small garnet stone set in plain gold prongs, and he held it out to her, and she took it and put it on her own finger, and held it up, and the garnet caught what little light there was in the overcast sky and gleamed dark red. He leaned across from his horse to hers, which required a degree of careful balance that might have looked undignified, and he kissed her for the first time, a brief and serious kiss with his hand gentle on her jaw, and she kissed him back, and the whole of the hill country spread out around them in its dormant winter beauty, and she thought that her father would have liked Chester Fletcher very much. They announced the engagement in December and were married in March of 1883 in the Harlan's Crossing Church, in a ceremony attended by most of the town, including some people who had stood on the courthouse steps 8 months earlier and said nothing in her defense, and who now came to her wedding with gifts and good wishes, which she received with grace because she had learned long ago that being right about something did not require other people to have been wrong about it forever. Hargrove came up from San Antonio and sat in the second row. Theodore Baines from the county clerk's office attended with his wife. Miguel Torres and the Carlson men were there, dressed in their best and looking slightly uncomfortable in their collars but genuinely happy. Chester, at the front of the church in a dark coat and a good hat held in his hands, looked at Matilda when she walked down the aisle with the steady, unhurried attention he had always given her, and she walked toward him with the same directness she had always brought to everything in her life, head up, hands still, eyes forward. The ceremony was plain and real, and entirely them. The Fletcher Ranch and the Wainwright Ranch were combined under joint management after the marriage, which made immediate practical sense given that they shared a fence line, and that their cattle operations were already partially integrated through the breeding arrangement. They discussed the arrangement carefully over several evenings before the wedding, and arrived at an operating structure that preserved the legal independence of both properties while combining their day-to-day management under a shared account, because that was how Chester approached important decisions, methodically and in partnership. Matilda retained full legal ownership of the Wainwright property and its associated water rights, which she had spent the better part of a year fighting to protect, and which she had no intention of subordinating to anyone's management, including her husband's, and Chester not only did not object to this, but had suggested it himself, because he understood exactly what that land represented to her, and what it had cost her to keep it. They ran the combined operation with 4 hands through their first full year of marriage, expanding the herd significantly with the combined resources of both properties. And in the spring of their first year together, they sold at market in Careville and turned the strongest profit that either ranch had produced independently. Matilda stood at the Careville market, watching the cattle move through the pens, and calculated the figure in her head, and felt a quiet, deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone and everything to do with the pleasure of work, done well on land that she loved. Chester stood beside her at the fence rail with his hat pulled against the wind off the hills and his shoulder warm against hers. 63 sold, he said. I know, she said. I counted. Of course you did, he said with the contained smile that was now entirely familiar to her and entirely precious. Next year we can push for 70 if the South Pasture expansion holds. It will hold, she said. I know it will, he said. She bumped his shoulder with hers, which was her way of saying a number of things without words, and he bumped her back, which was his way of receiving them. In the autumn of 1883, Matilda discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Chester on a Sunday evening in October, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, and he was quiet for a moment after she said it, and then he looked at her with an expression she had not quite seen on his face before, something open and slightly undone and very warm, and he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Are you well, he said, which was the first thing he asked because that was Chester. Very well, she said, physically and otherwise. Otherwise, he repeated, checking. I am very happy, she said clearly, because she knew he needed to hear it and because it was entirely true. Good, he said. And then he brought her hand to his lips and held it there for a moment in a gesture that was purely tender and said more than most long speeches. She was healthy throughout the pregnancy, which she attributed in part to the fact that she refused to modify her routines more than was absolutely necessary, a position that the town doctor, a man named Prentice who was sensible enough by the standards of the era, endorsed with more enthusiasm than she had expected. She continued to ride until January, when she transitioned to driving the wagon, and she continued to manage the ranch accounts and the herd management through the spring. Their son was born in June of 1884, on a Tuesday morning that started clear and hot and bright, which felt appropriate for a child of the hill country. He was a healthy, substantial baby who announced himself to the world with a volume and conviction that Chester said was clearly inherited, and that Matilda attributed to the same quality in Chester. They named him Henry George Fletcher. Henry for Chester's father, who had died some years before, and George for Matilda's father. Two good men, whose names the boy would carry into a future that neither of them had lived to see. Chester held Henry in the hour after his birth with the expression of a man confronting something larger than his previous categories of experience, and finding it not frightening but simply very, very significant. He looked at the child and then at Matilda with an expression of such comprehensive love and gratitude that she felt it like a physical warmth. He looks like you, Chester said. He has your chin, Matilda said. That's unfortunate for him, Chester said. She laughed, which hurt somewhat given the recent exertions of childbirth, but which was entirely worth it. Henry George Fletcher grew up on the combined Wainwright-Fletcher operation with the particular confidence of a child who is deeply loved and given serious work to do from an early age. He helped with the cattle at 4 and could identify 40 different wildflowers by their proper names at 6, taught by his mother who had learned them from her father's books. He had Chester's steadiness and Matilda's precision, and the combination made him the kind of child who was a pleasure to be around. In 1886, their daughter arrived, whom they named Clara Margaret Fletcher, Margaret for a beloved aunt of Chester's who had helped finance his initial move to Texas, and she came into the world with Matilda's dark eyes and a stubbornness that both of her parents claimed came from the other one. The ranch continued to grow. By 1887, the combined Fletcher-Wainwright operation was one of the larger and more stable cattle operations in that part of the hill country, with a reputation for fair dealing and good stock that brought buyers from as far as Bixar County. Matilda managed the accounts and the contracts and the herd health records with the meticulous attention she had always brought to the work, and Chester managed the land and the hands and the day-to-day operations, And between them, the whole thing functioned with a kind of easy, complementary efficiency that made the work feel less like labor and more like a partnership so well matched that it was almost effortless. It was never actually effortless, of course. There were dry years and hard markets, and a severe fever that swept through the herd in the spring of 1886 and cost them 20 head before they contained it. There were difficult negotiations with the railroad interests that were moving through the hill country in the mid-1880s and wanting right-of-way through various properties. There were the ordinary difficulties of raising 2 children in a working landscape while also running a serious business. But none of it broke them, and none of it came close to the sustained, grinding threat of those early years when Matilda had been fighting alone against the accumulated weight of other people's assumptions about what she could and could not do. She had earned her security not by having it handed to her, but by defending it with everything she had, and the fact that she had done that work informed the peace of the years that followed in a way that made the peace feel like something real and chosen, rather than simply the absence of conflict. There was a day in the fall of 1887 when Matilda was riding the south fence line of the Wainwright property, alone in the October afternoon while Chester was at the market in Careville, and she stopped her horse at the point where the new fence met the old one, at the corner where the land she had purchased from Gunderson connected to the original property boundary. She sat on her horse and looked out over the south pasture, the grass still carrying some green from the recent rains, the cattle moving slowly at the far end, with the particular unhurried purpose of well-tended stock. The oaks on the ridgeline were going amber and bronze. The sky above them was the deep, saturated blue that comes in the Texas hill country on October afternoons when the summer heat is fully gone. She thought about the morning 4 years ago when she had been in that ditch hauling fence posts by herself, furious and uncertain, and not yet knowing that the man on the horse looking down at her would be, 4 years later, her husband and her partner and the father of her children. She thought about the courthouse steps and the crowd of people who had accepted without examination that she was not capable of managing what she had built. She thought about Chester's voice cutting through Pratt's speech with the flat certainty of a man who had been watching her work for over a year and had no patience for the lie. Nobody had called her capable. Not in all those years of her father's silence and the town's comfortable dismissal. Not until Chester Fletcher had called it loudly in front of everyone who had not. She was not sentimental about it in the way that would have required her to feel grateful for having been seen, because the capability had been real and present all along, independent of anyone's acknowledgement of it. But she understood what his words had done in that moment, not created the truth of her competence, but broken the social mechanism that had been weaponized against it. He had taken the assumption that everyone had agreed to without examining it and placed it in direct public contradiction to the observable evidence, and the observable evidence had won. She was thinking about this with the quiet pleasure of a person reviewing a battle fully won when she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to see Chester riding up the fence line from the north, an hour earlier than she had expected him. "Market finish early," she called. "Got what we needed in the morning session," he said, drawing up beside her. He looked at her face in the way he had always looked at her, that attentive, thorough look. "Thinking. About the courthouse steps," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I think about it sometimes too," he said. "What do you think about it?" He considered. "I think it was the moment I stopped pretending to myself that what I felt was only about fairness or neighboring," he said. "Because when Pratt started talking about your incapability, I felt something considerably more personal than civic indignation." She smiled at him. "Considerably more personal," she repeated. "Significantly more," he said. "That is perhaps the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," she told him. "It competes with the post drivers over here," he said. She laughed, and he laughed with her, which was a sound she had not heard from him in those early months of their acquaintance, and which she had later understood was not a sound he made easily, but one that she had somehow, gradually, become necessary to producing. She reached across and took his hand, and they held hands on horseback in the October afternoon, which was somewhat awkward geometrically, but which neither of them was inclined to give up for that reason, looking out over the south pasture of the Wainwright ranch together. "I was thinking something else too," she said after a while. "What's that?" he said. "Henry has been talking about wanting to learn to drive the cattle wagon." "He's 3, Chester said. "He's 3.5, Matilda said, and he is entirely his father's son in the sense of being certain he can do things before he has tried them." "He gets that from you," Chester said. "He absolutely does not," she said. The evidence suggests nothing," she said. "I am a woman of demonstrated competence. Chester Fletcher said so publicly." He looked at her with the smile that she had come to think of as hers, specifically hers, the one that he did not show to the world in general, but that emerged reliably in private when she said something that pleased him. "He did," Chester said. "He meant it." "I know," she said simply, and she did. They rode back toward the house together along the fence line, as the October light went amber and long across the grass, and the children could be heard somewhere near the barn, Henry's voice carrying across the yard with the particular volume of a child who has not yet learned about the existence of indoor voices, and Clara's answering shriek suggesting either injury or delight, both of which were equally possible with a 1-year-old. Chester quickened his horse slightly, and Matilda did the same, and they came into the yard together to find Henry attempting to teach his baby sister to stand, with the patient, slightly exasperated manner of a child who has decided that 3.5 is a perfectly good age to take on pedagogical responsibilities. "She keeps sitting down," Henry reported seriously to his parents. "She's still working on it," Matilda told him, swinging down from her horse. "You were the same way." Henry considered this information with the expression of someone who found it mildly improbable. "I was not," he said. "You absolutely were," Chester said, taking Clara up from the ground and holding her in the way he held all small things with careful, natural ease. Clara grabbed his ear and examined it with scientific interest. "You sat down 17 times before you got it, I counted." Henry looked at his father with the expression of someone reassessing a situation. 17, he said. "Give or take," Chester said. "The point is you got up 17 times too. That's the part that matters." Henry thought about this with the serious attention of a child who is filing information away for future use. Then he turned back to his sister and crouched down next to her with the resigned patience of someone who has decided the work continues regardless. Matilda stood in the yard in the October afternoon and looked at her husband holding their daughter and her son teaching his sister to stand with the patient stubbornness of a child who had learned patience from the right people. And she felt the full shape of the life she had built and defended and chosen, spread out around her in the hill country light. It was not a life without difficulty. It would continue to have difficult years, dry years, hard markets, the ordinary accumulation of challenges that come with working land and raising children and living in a place that has its own demands. The world was changing around them, the railroads coming, the cattle market shifting, the long era of the open range already in its decline by the mid-1880s, and in 10 years the hill country would look different from how it looked now. But the foundation was solid and real and genuinely hers, in a way that went deeper than legal ownership or financial stability. It was hers because she had fought for it and understood its value, and refused to let it be taken from her by the hidden motives of men who had mistaken her silence for weakness. It was hers because she had built it out of practical intelligence and relentless effort, and the refusal to accept other people's low assessment of what she could do. And it was also theirs, hers and Chester's together, which was something different from and larger than either of those things alone. Not because he had rescued her, because he had not, because she had been winning her own fight before the courthouse steps and would have found a way to win it with or without his public words. She believed that genuinely. But because he had seen her and said it plainly, and in doing so had offered her something that had been withheld from her through all the years she had been working in silence toward the recognition she deserved. He had offered her the simple, transformative experience of being known by someone who chose, every day, to keep knowing her. She walked over to him and took Clara from his arms, and Clara transferred her scientific interest to Matilda's hair, and Chester stood close beside her in the way that had become as natural as the hill country light, which was everywhere and warm, and you only noticed it when it wasn't there. "I was thinking we should expand the north pasture next spring," she said. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "The soil assessment on that section looked good. We could run another 20 head if we manage the rotation right. Closer to 25 with the water access from the tributary," he said. "You checked the tributary survey." "Last week," he said. "I was going to show you the figures tonight." Henry had gotten Clara to stand, finally, a momentary triumph that both children acknowledged with great ceremony before Clara sat down again with the philosophical acceptance of an infant who has decided that standing is fine in principle. "Again," Henry said firmly. "Again," Matilda agreed softly, watching. The hill country evening settled in around them, the October sky going deep in the east while the west stayed amber bright. The way evenings did in that country that Chester had come to from Missouri with $140 and had built something real on. The way evenings did in this country that Matilda had grown up in and worked and nearly lost and kept. The way evenings did on land that was genuinely and completely and irrevocably theirs. Henry got Clara standing again, and this time she stayed up for 3 full seconds before sitting back down, and the pride on Henry's face was so enormous and unguarded that both of his parents were smiling without quite deciding to. The way people smile at something that is entirely right with the world. Chester put his arm around Matilda's shoulders, and she leaned slightly into the warmth of it, and the ranch lay spread out around them in the October light, alive and stable and genuinely theirs, and everything that had been fought for and defended and built together was present in that moment in the most ordinary and complete way possible, which is how things that truly last tend to be. Henry looked up from his sister and regarded his parents with the assessing gaze of a child who is developing an opinion about most things. "You are both in the way of the light," he informed them. "We are standing in our own yard," Chester said. "You are still in the way of the light," Henry said. Matilda laughed, and Chester laughed, and the evening came in full around them, and the night birds started up in the oaks by the creek, and the lamplight began to glow warm through the windows of the house where supper needed making and accounts needed updating and children needed putting to bed. And all of it, every single ordinary and necessary piece of it, was exactly what she had wanted. She had built this. She had kept it. She had been seen in the keeping of it by someone who chose to see her truly, and who had then stayed every day since, as deliberate and present and choosing as he had been on the first day he had walked her fence line without being asked, and helped her haul fence posts out of a ditch without making a single comment about whether she ought to be the one doing it. The stars were coming out now above the hill country. The same stars that had been above this land for all the generations before her, and would be above it for all the generations after. And somewhere under those stars, Reginald Pratt was serving his sentence, and the county clerk's office held the correct and complete record of the Wainwright property with all its water rights intact, and the Harlan's Crossing courthouse steps held the echo of the words nobody in that town had said before Chester Fletcher said them. Capable. She had always been capable. And the ranch and the family and the life around her in that October evening were the full and unambiguous proof of it. Chester moved toward the house and Matilda followed with Clara on her hip, and Henry ran ahead to be first through the door because he was 3½ and being first through doors was one of the important competitions of his day. And the door swung open and the lamplight came out warm into the October air, and they went in together to the life they had built, which was good and solid and entirely real, and which would last.